Well, hello everyone. I am really excited about having this conversation with my colleague, Professor Ayanna Howard. It's very interesting that we are having a book conversation in person, but we have some colleagues joining us physically in the room, which is refreshing. And we were commenting that we've managed to have the first sort of physical book presentation in a long time. But her book is not physical. It's an audiobook, which I have downloaded from the cloud and listened to it. It's just a beautiful book. The other thing that you need to know that I've learned, one of the things we have in common, which is the fact that both of us are introverts. I learned that about you in the book. So here you have a conversation about a virtual book by two introverts. About very difficult topics. What can go wrong? We'll do just fine. So Ayanna, thank you so much for agreeing to discuss it. This has been just a fabulous book to listen to, really. But before I start asking you questions about it, I want to get your sense of trust as someone who's dedicated your life to robots. I want to get your sense of trust in robots doing things in your own life. So I'm going to ask you some examples of robots, and you need to tell me, would you trust it or not?
Okay.
Does it? All right. So easy one. Would you trust? No. I told you, two introverts having a guy. This is going to be very short. Vacuum cleaning your house.
Yes, if I had a carpet.
So, but you wouldn't mind that?
Yeah.
Okay. Mowing the grass. A robot mowing the grass.
Yes, if I had no kids. I could be eaten up by them. You notice I always have a caveat.
Yeah. Okay. But otherwise, but that starts restricting the use. How about driving your car?
Yes.
How about, and this may foreshadow a later, more complex conversation, how about a super cool robot policing your neighborhood?
Absolutely not.
With that. So, by the way, just for all of you to know, the book that we're discussing today, it's an audiobook, which is beautifully narrated by Amanda Stenberg, who is known for her role in the Hunger Games. And Dr. Howard just gave me a hard time for not knowing that before but I'll tell you, the performance, the reading of the book is phenomenal. Now, I know that President Obama just announced his book, and he reads his own book. Walk me through the process of having someone else narrate yours.
Yeah, so one, I was going to originally narrate it, but they said, we have someone who we think is perfect. She studies you. She kind of believes in the same things. And I was like, oh, who is it? And they said, Rick. Now, for anyone who's into science fiction, I was like, not the Rick. They're like, yeah. I was like, didn't she do The Hate You Give? I was like, they were like, yeah. I was like, oh, I'm not doing it.
Actually, it's pretty awesome. I have a little bit of it, so you can hear it. We're going to use a very advanced Georgia Tech technology. Let's see.
If I could collect $1 for every time AI is going to take all of our jobs, I would probably be a millionaire twice over. There's another question that makes me laugh. Aren't you worried that if you make robots smart, they will destroy us all? If they only knew how not so smart our robots really are right now. In these situations, I take up the challenge to explain both sides of the story. I feel it's my duty to share my knowledge while at the same time sharing some truth. This is real talk. My profession? I'm a roboticist. I also might be the oldest Black woman roboticist alive, although I still feel pretty young.
Okay, for the rest, you have to buy it. Or you can download it from a local library near you. But you can see, in fact, okay, this is, I lied. We did have a short conversation about this, and you shared with me that, tell me what your mom said when she heard the voice.
Oh, so she actually said, you know, she sounds like you were 20 years ago, which was actually a compliment. And so if you listen to it, so I have a quirky humor. I'm into science fiction. So if you're into science fiction, you will love it because you'll be like, oh, I totally get it. She sounds like me.
No.
Young me.
No, it is. It is. So, and it is a beautiful piece, and I love the way you weave in your own personal life with very profound questions about AI and robots that even people, actually, especially people who don't know anything about AI and robots, should be asking themselves. And you blend those. One of those that maybe you can talk about sort of your discovery of saying, this is what I want to do professionally. And I think you mentioned a story of, I think maybe when you were spending time at the JPL. Tell us a little bit about how that happened.
So my first, was my second job as a student. I was a student intern at NASA's JPL. And the first task I had was programming up satellites. So it was like database management, IT things. And I finished it because, you know, it was like data. So they let me explore. And one of the nice things is like back then there was like no security. So you just walked in and opened up a door. And there was this one room I went in, and I remember I saw one of the very first rovers. Right? I saw this manipulator arm that was doing surgery on an eye. And I was like, this is like the stuff in the books. Like it's real. It's not just in the books. And so I was like, you know what? This is real stuff. It's not imaginary. I'm going down this direction.
And you did. Now that you share a few situations, it would be probably years until you find another Black woman doing robotics. So for many, many years in your professional career, you were it.
No, I looked in the mirror. It's like,
oh, there's two of us. and in fact, you call yourself for a lot of that time an anomaly, right? And dealing with that. Did that give you any advantage? I mean, I can imagine the disadvantages of having to prove yourself, but is there anything that you got from being that quote unquote anomaly?
Yes, because every time you walk into the room, you see things differently, right? Like everyone's like talking in one way and you're like, I don't see that. And so you bring that diversity of thought because you just don't see it the same way. And that's actually a positive.
So the book spends a lot of time, and this was an eye-opener in many ways of how, you would think that once we built AI and robots, that we would build them better than us in some ways, right? Like, and somehow we have managed to transfer some of our worst attributes to them, right? Make them sexist, make them racist. So how did that happen? If even for folks, I mean, there are folks here who are computer science students. Many of us are not. Help us understand, how did we manage to do that?
So one of the things is when we design robots, we design AI, we build them in our image, just like Frankenstein, right? It's like we have this concept of the robot's supposed to work with us in our human jobs. And so we don't really understand our own biases. And so when we're creating AI, we're creating robots, we're just mimicking us, not realizing that we're also mimicking and amplifying our own biases.
But how does that happen in practice? It's not like someone starts programming an AI and says, I want you to be as racist as I am, something, right? How does it happen in practice?
Yeah, so I'll give you a really good example. Recognition, since that's in the news. So imagine I'm a developer, I'm programming, I'm thinking data sets, and so maybe I'm a Black female, so I collect all these data sets. I'm like, okay, I'm going to put in the woman, I have Hispanic, I have Black, I have white. Okay, this is great, I trained my algorithm. Well, guess what? Got the 60-year-olds, right? Because I'm not that old. And so it doesn't even occur to me that like older people use computers and like maybe they'll be walking outside and they need to be recognized. And so then the systems get deployed in real world scenarios, in surveillance, in policing. Now the data set or the data that was left out that wasn't used to train, it's like I'm out of luck. And so, if I'm a 65-year-old, I better actually, staying at home is actually okay now. But
So what's very interesting is that in a way that explains why it is so essential that we bring diversity into technology, right? So because if the process you describe, where we use the data sets that we're familiar with and whatnot, well, if AI is driven by a type of person, which right now tends to be youngish, white, and male, then that's what we're going to get.
it is. And the thing is why I'm so passionate about this is that the world is diverse. And so if you think about what the world looks like, it's not even US-centric. Like I have a US-centric point of view, and even I know that I think about things in that US-centric point of view. And so if you have a very small group creating technology for the rest of the world, we're guaranteed 100%, no hypothesize, is that we are going to screw it up.
So let's talk about some examples. Like, okay, scare us about what can go wrong. So because of course there's the case of, oh, Facebook doesn't recognize my face because I am a black woman. Well, it kind of sucks, but okay, if Facebook didn't recognize my face, it's not the end of the world. But there are some of the other examples you mentioned in the book that are kind of bad.
Yeah.
So give us some.
So I will give you an example. Again, facial recognition, because you've heard about it. So recently, actually this summer, there was a black man in Detroit that was falsely recognized using facial recognition. He was arrested, like at his house, and they say in front of his kids. You're like, yeah, well, Now imagine that same facial recognition software, it actually was deployed for surveillance of protests overseas. And those were young college students, right? In all shapes, all sizes. And so now think about it. Anyone here, to be falsely recognized, and you're arrested.
Okay, let's get on the scary theme here. Legal system, like, are we already using? I think I heard that in your book that we're already even using some of these AI systems to decide on whether you get out on bail or not, or what can go wrong.
Yeah. So in terms of legal system, so criminal recidivism, AI is being used to decide whether you should stay in jail or not. And we already know that the jail system, at least in the United States and elsewhere, is already biased. We already know that. And now we are amplifying these biases with our AI system. And so you think, well, maybe they were already criminals going in. Yeah, so they stay in jail a little longer. But, imagine all of the young students that, maybe they just made that one mistake. Maybe they stole that candy bar just once and they had a record. Well, guess what? That candy bar will now put you for life in jail, right? Because now AI is amplifying.
So, but in a way, so let's talk about solutions. Because if I'm going to train, even if I'm incredibly well intentioned and I'm working in that field of AI applications in the legal system, the data sets that I have at my disposal already reflect that history of bias, right? So if, let's say, if black people are getting more severe penalties for drug possession, let's say, and that's the data that I'm using to train my systems, in a way, I'm going to perpetuate those biases, right? So what's the alternative?
There's a false assumption that we can't. And so think about it. Like historically, women couldn't vote. Like today, we can. And so think about it that if we know fundamentally what's right or wrong. And so we fundamentally know that we can design these systems so that they are our better self, so they can learn our better self. If I'm designing a search algorithm, why is it that most of the doctors, surgeons are male, right? Like that's a falsity because, medical school now it's about 50-50, right? So what does that mean? That's perpetuating a past historical that we want to move out of. So we can change. We always change. And so I think AI can help influence us in that change.
And how do you do that?
So one is like, we need to take responsibility. And so I always say, like, when you go into search, how many of you choose like the first three options? Like, do you ever go to like the second page or the third page? Absolutely not. I mean, some is like, oh, this is not. And so they've shown research that one, most people choose the three. And if the top three don't reflect your bias, change your search, right? You're like, oh, the wrong search. Let me put in something else. So that's wrong. And so one of the ways is these are AI systems. It's based on data. Like if everyone in the world literally went to the third page, the results would change. But of course, people aren't going to do that. And that's just one example of the power we have.
So you're talking about that even the users of AI can help make AI better. In fact, I thought you gave an example. I don't know if I'm remembering this right. Like if you say, you know, who won the soccer, the World Cup, you're going to get the men's World Cup, right? Automatically.
That's going to be your choice.
But then you say, I, as a user, what kind of, I mean, how can I help shape Google so that Google becomes less biased going forward?
Yeah, so if we start giving the data reflecting our own desires and biases. So soccer, you would say women's soccer, right? Or men's soccer, right? Like be very explicit. It'll give it to you. And that means that soccer in general won't always be referred to as men. Governor, if I put in governor, it already knows what my affiliation is. Guess what governor is going to put, right? And so think about it. If I explicitly say Democratic governor, Republican governor, independent governor, it's going to basically unbias itself because we are saying, look, I have a bias, I'm going to claim it. We're not going to have an assumption that there's one answer.
Right. And that requires a lot of discipline on the side of the user. So I guess that's very interesting. So what you're saying is it's not just that sort of Google search was created biased, is that because we are bringing our own biases when we do search, we're making Google biased to reflect us.
Just reflecting biases. And they try, like every so often, they'll do something like, oh, we're going to fix this. And then what happens? Us humans mess it up again, right? Because it's retraining on us.
Yeah. So I tested this. I think you mentioned that in the book, and it hasn't changed yet because I tested it yesterday and it worked. So I asked, and that I would love to hear the story behind this. I asked Google, do Black Lives Matter? Do this at home. And you can ask Google, you can ask Siri, and I don't know if Alexa, you can ask any of them. And I was quite surprised by the answer. But that's not an answer that the system has been trained to produce. So that's someone who has sort of a human that has gone in and said, okay, this is not right, I have to fix it. Yeah, but how do you do that when there are millions and thousands of questions that we're asking that are going to provide those biased answers? I mean, this one is such a contemporary big question that I can see someone on Google say, okay, let's not get ourselves in trouble, let's change this. Right?
And that's usually that override is when people, and so I'm always about empowerment of us, right? Because when we have a collective and we have a voice, things change. I give example, green. Like think about how many companies went green. No, it's not an incentive. It's not like they're making money for going green, but yet people said, no, this is important. We think about sustainability. So with all these things, if you said, I do not want my voice assistants to have a female voice, right? Like if all of us said, look, give me the choice to choose male or female or British or American, right? They would change. The companies want to make sure that their customers are happy.
So that's one of the things that I've been sort of obsessed over after the book, which is I had never reflected on the fact that the default voice on Google is a female voice. And I had never reflected on the fact that the default voice on Siri is a female voice. Why? First of all, it's like, why all these different companies somehow made the same choice?
because they are catering to our biases. So as you know, at least in the US, most assistants are female. And so it doesn't even occur to you that your assistant shouldn't be female. So it doesn't occur to you that your AI assistant shouldn't be female. Right? And so they're just catering on, oh, they're going to like this and not even going to question. Whereas if it's a male, you'd be like, maybe I shouldn't be using Siri. It's feel kind of weird. Right? And so they want to capitalize on our fallacies.
Uh-huh. So, okay, this is a very important question for Georgia Tech. In fact, I asked that question to our colleague, Charles Isbell, Dean of Computing, who's with us today, which is, given that state of affairs and all that is at stake, right? Knowing that AI and robots are quite literally penetrating every aspect of our life, how we get diagnosed with a disease, how we get treated if we are arrested, how we, the list goes on. How do we make sure that more people of different backgrounds join the ranks of AI companies and programs in universities so that we start changing things?
I think this is, I'm going to put a, woo-woo on Georgia Tech. So I think one of the responsibilities as educators is to ensure access to AI and computing, but also ensure ethical. And so it's like, it's not just teaching the latest Java code or teaching the latest AI algorithm. It's teaching here's an AI algorithm, and the data set is going to be focused on something that has bias. And so retraining, because I actually always say, like, I talk about these stories and, criminal recidivism and AI, but those developers went to college, right? And so some of this responsibility actually resides on us as educators, because we didn't train that part of them. And now we're like, oh, those bad companies, and I do those bad companies, but those were our students, 10, 20 years ago. I think we can fix that by thinking how to retrain our students.
Now, going to your own personal story, which is a big part of the book, and there's some characters that come in the story who had a very positive effect in you, but some other characters not so much, right? And they probably didn't even know what they were doing when they were reacting to you in certain ways. So those of us who, whether it's we teach or we advise students or we mentor students who may be clueless, I mean, anything that we can do to be better at making sure that we're not shortcutting potentially incredibly successful careers.
Yeah, so I think
I know that's a big question.
No, but I think one of the things is always believe in whoever you're working with. Sometimes you might say they just don't get it. They're not going to be a great computer scientist. I think that's your own bias, because we know that some of that is because you see someone that doesn't look like you. Like, yeah, so they don't look like you. They can't possibly be a computer scientist. And so it's believe in every single person that comes in, that is going to be the person that finds a cure for cancer. That is going to be the person that figures out how to fly and send people to Mars. Like, that belief means that you are taking in all the anomalies, and maybe we will find a cure for cancer. We don't know. We might have been able to find a vaccine for COVID if that one student 20 years ago hadn't been turned off of science. We don't know.
That's right. That's right. So I'm going to I have more questions for you, but I'm going to make just a reminder that if people have questions, and if you're watching this online, you can enter them in the chat. If you're here in the room, you can text them and they will be introduced in the chat. And who is going to be asking the questions from the room? You are? Okay. Do you have any questions yet? Okay, why don't you go ahead with what I'll save mine for next.
So we have one here. Dr. Howard, you are an extraordinary leader, school chair, scholar, teacher, mother, and community champion. How in the world do you do it all?
And I'm also a Zumba instructor, FY. So I blend it all with things that I care about and I'm passionate. So it actually doesn't feel like I am, doing 10 or 20 different things. And so because of that, I'm an educator, but my education also links to my research. I'm a mother, but my kids are engineers and scientists, so obviously it rubbed off. And so it really is, I do one job, it just has different tasks that are associated with it.
Keep going.
So, Dr. Howard, what made you decide to get into computer science in the first place?
So, I'm a weird hybrid. I was classically trained as an engineer, but I taught myself computer science because back then I didn't know what computer science was. I wanted to do robotics, and robots were built with hardware, so that meant engineering, but I liked the intelligence. And so I got into that. My first program was I'm going to age myself, something called BASIC, and then Pascal, for those out there that know what that is or know how to spell that.
Hey, I know both.
See? You just aged yourself.
I know.
And so this was back in pretty much middle school, high school.
Yeah, please.
You mentioned the problems of a technology being U.S.-centric. How do you suggest expanding that worldwide because diversity is enormous?
Yeah, so this is a problem with the fact that most of the companies are present in basically one area of the United States, majority, and there's some tendrils elsewhere. What's hopeful is that companies are starting to go into these areas. So there's companies in India. Africa now is a continent that companies are interested in because of demographic. And so one of the things is like pushing forward these companies, but also pushing forward programs like, Georgia Tech should have a Georgia Tech Africa campus, right? So that we can also influence how the students are grown. So they have a workforce that can work for these companies. He wrote that, Georgia Tech Africa. You saw that, right?
Yeah, yes. Hey,
This question might be,
please go ahead.
This question might be for both of you. What steps is Georgia Tech taking to address these issues that you're discussing in the curriculum for online master's programs?
Actually, we're going to pass that on to Josh later. How convenient.
Convenient and completely out of nowhere. Actually, Ayanna has an answer to this question because Ayanna is teaching the first class in the online Master of Science, Computer Science, specifically around ethics and data science. Is that not correct, Ayanna?
That is correct.
Why don't you tell us about it?
That's what a dean does. Throws.
Yeah.
Leadership.
I did the same thing to him.
So I created a course, Ethical AI, for the students, kind of ramping it up. One of the nice things is that at some point it might become a requirement, just like, algorithms. And really it's, you learn a little natural language processing, you learn facial recognition, you learn about predictive algorithms, but it's all under the vein of what does this mean in terms of disparate impact? What does this mean in terms of different groups and things like that? So trying to retrain the students that are coming out as Masters of Computer Science that have this understanding of the ethical constraints and implications.
Let me jump in, and we recently announced the establishment of a center for AI and ethics, and so the broad question is why does it matter? Why is it so crucial that we devote efforts to that?
So the reason is because the world is adopting AI at an accelerated rate. And like I say, the train has left the station and people are adopting it and companies are pushing for it because people say, I want this quality of life and things like that. But we have to do it responsibly. And we have to do it so that we can retrain our thinking as engineers and computer scientists. Like, I like playing in the play box, right? Like, I was trained like gadgets and cool things. And yeah, I don't really care who's using it because I'm using it. And we have to redo that, but it really requires a concerted effort of engineers, computer scientists, ethicists, social scientists to really carve out what does this mean.
So I know I failed the test on the Hunger Games.
Yes.
But I did read Asimov growing up.
Okay.
And it surprises me that when we talk about ethics of robots, that we still go back to Asimov, who, by the way, wrote it as part of a novel. He wasn't even trying to build a theory of ethics for robots, but we don't seem to have made much more progress. So how do we? So let's play examples of. I mean, why it is so essential that we come up with at least a theory of ethical conduct for a robot.
So for those of you who don't know, the 3 laws of robotics, one is, thou shalt not harm a human being. So an example for that would be, thou shalt not harm a human being, then maybe we shouldn't create killer robots, right? Like that's rule number 1. But then what happens if you have a nanny robot in your home and someone breaks in and is about to do something bad to your kids? Well, then the robot says, oh, sorry, thou shalt not kill. Go on, Robert, kill the kids. I don't care, right? And so this is the dilemma. And so rule number 1, that does not work.
So, and of course, you talk in the book about the classic dilemmas of self-driving car going down the street, and this is not anymore too hypothetical, right? I mean, we already have Teslas and other cars with some of these systems built in. Anyway, just car is going down the street, and you find yourself in a pickle. If I don't do anything, I'm going to run into this pedestrian. The wall on my left, I can't do that. If I turn right, I kill a different pedestrian. And you have to choose A or B. Now, in the absence of a reflection about ethical principles for that robot, I guess the robot would have to choose at random or something.
Right.
So how do we get to that? Because we don't even have those answers ourselves as humans. In fact, you mentioned that different cultures.
So the trolley problem, which I will tell you, a lot of researchers kind of barf at this because they're like, yeah, this is not going to ever happen. But depending on where you are, right? So if you're in a self-driving car and you basically have to kill someone, that's really what it is. If you're in places where the social economics is wider, you kill the poor people, right? If you have a place where women don't have as many rights, you kill the woman, right? And so it's actually tightly coupled with the values of the region that you're deploying in.
So that means that now the world is going to be governed by the values of 27-year-olds in Silicon Valley. I mean, this is a frightening prospect here.
Exactly. I'm not arguing with you. I have no answer. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. All right. So how do we do better than that? Give us some hope.
Yeah. So one, the hope is that we really think about this aspect of how do you bring all of the individuals worldwide to the table, designing, developing, and deploying these robotic systems. So that's one. The other is ensuring that we all do have a voice. Even if you're not a developer or computer scientist, we all have a voice. We've had movements this summer from just everyone that has changed policies and regulations, right? We all have a voice as long as we speak up. And so I think it's that belief as well. And that applies to AI and robotics. I was so surprised when they had this ban on facial recognition software. And cities, Boston of all places, right? Like said, we're not doing this. It was like, oh my gosh, like there's a movement and it's impacting the world because people are voicing their opinions and just saying, hey, this is wrong, we need to do better.
So, and you are part of the gang that is developing this technology.
Exactly.
And you're telling us we shouldn't trust it. Actually, that's how we started this conversation, right? When you say I would not trust the robot to police my neighborhood.
Yeah, so I'm an optimist. I think that the positives of deploying AI are actually better, right? So if you look at AI for medical diagnosis, yeah, there's bias, but if you compare it to what it was like before, people's lives are being saved. If you're looking at robots for healthcare and education, there are more kids that are being trained because we have access to AI and tutors, right? So everything is shifting in the positive, but we need to make sure that the positive is positive for everyone equally. And that's really where I think we need to move.
So, okay, I have another set of questions, but I'm not. I'm going to open it up for a few from the audience. Go ahead.
So previously, people who didn't want to go to college went to work in factories, et cetera, and earned a decent salary. However, these places of employment are no longer available, and automation has taken over more jobs. This large group of people are disenfranchised. How can AI not add more division of society?
So I do worry about that. And there's some efforts going on to try to bridge that digital divide and AI divide now. And so one of the things is that if you think about AI, AI can be used as a partner to do retraining. Right? So I'm not a computer scientist necessarily, but I want to be an accountant. I didn't go to school for accounting, but I'm a smart person. I like numbers. I like math. I can, like all those things. Well, if you pair that person who's smart with an AI agent that does know accounting, you can actually do training on the job to grow. And so we need to do a lot more of that. You see it in some places. There are some manufacturing plants, for example, that are using virtual reality and AI and scaffolding, like on-the-job training. So we just need to do a lot more of it.
Please go ahead.
Follow up to that question about how high school students who did not go to college for whatever reason, how do they prepare for this world of AI? And I think you touched on it there, but would you like to go further in that?
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna highlight a program in the School of Interactive Computing that's by Professor Betsy DeSalvo called DataWorks, and she actually is taking individuals who are not necessarily in college, and she's making them data wranglers. Because remember, AI needs all this data. Who do you think is curating the data and labeling the data and making sure that the AI can learn on it? So there's a whole job field that exists because AI is out there. Like what happens when your AI software goes bad or is rogue, right? We have, Apple Genius Bar. We don't have an AI Genius Bar. Like we can train a whole workforce of like, this is what you do when the AI goes bad or AI goes rogue and things like this.
You seem to be moving back and forth between AI and robots. Is there something special about robots having a physical form that makes them special?
So the way I define robots and AI, and I put them together, so robot is a physical embodiment, but it has an AI brain. Whereas AI by itself is the brain, which can be virtual, as well as coupled with a robot. And so that's why I use them interchangeably. And in fact, if you Google robot, the first 3 choices will actually be an AI virtual agent in general. But given that, we do know, and this is some of the research at Georgia Tech as well, that when you have a physical embodiment, there is something different about the interaction. People actually bond more with the physical agent. Again, it doesn't even have to be a humanoid. It could be like a Furby that's automated. People actually bond with the physical more than they do the virtual. As this room shows, the human-human interaction, the human-robot interaction is very much the same.
And if I may add to that, because I have been to your lab, and I love the different shapes of robots that you're experimenting with, and some of your own research actually deals with that question, right? Of what type of robot inspires more trust, and what have we learned? I mean, is that the more human like a robot is, the more I trust it, or the more it freaks me out?
No, the more that it moves and can move with you, it doesn't matter if it's human shape or so one of the robots I have is basically a tin can with arms. It's an emergency evacuation robot. And people trust it just as much as my humanoid robot that actually has a real shape and has voice recognition because it moves and it has the right behavior. That's all you need.
Wow, that's very interesting. So in my prior job, we actually we were the first campus to deploy these little robots that deliver pizza and Starbucks to you. And they're like a cooler on wheels, and you basically order your pizza and the computer knows where you are, and 10 minutes later, this little guy shows up and you get your pizza. And it fascinated me to see how people interact. It was the first time I saw robots interacting with people at scale And I feel like since we didn't know what to do with robots, like we're treating them like pets. Like people reacted to them like how cute, like people almost like we wanted to pet them or something. And it's a cooler on wheels. And is that not normal?
Yes, it is. It is normal. I'm always so surprised when I bring my robots out to just like people and outreach. I mean, there's like, the cameo shots, and I'm like, oh, I guess this is unusual for a lot of people. But yes, it doesn't matter. If it moves,
Yeah.
it's like fascinating.
It is fascinating. But people treated them like pets, even for bad. Even there were bad people that did bad things to these robots, like love to like turn them upside down and, have the little robot. I mean, it's amazing. Like the little things drew the the worst in us too.
Yeah, so there is violence against robots, unfortunately. The thing.
Yeah. Give us some examples. You mentioned some of those in the book too, right?
Yeah, I did. So, and these are just a couple of examples. So, robots in Japan, there was a couple of them where the kids basically, threw soda and marked it up with the crayon because it couldn't do anything. Thou shalt not harm humans. They know that there was a robot that was, across America, so it was fine when it was in Europe. As soon as it came to the Americas, it was beheaded in 2 weeks, right? Like that tells you something about U.S.-centric point of view, right? So that's an example of, violence against robots. You've seen engineers on YouTube beating up the, robot dog, and people are like, oh, this is so horrible, so horrible. And you think, the robot is mechanical. It doesn't even know it's being hurt, but people really, they're violent, but then people have this reaction of, well, that's just wrong.
So I have a couple more. I was very intrigued by how someone who's been trained as an engineer, who teaches in a college of computing, that you had the guts to write a book on sex, race, and robots. Like say, okay, can I pick any like harder topics that, by the way, that bring you outside of the realm of programming a computer, and they bring you in the realm of big questions we're asking ourselves, and you went there, and you actually even, because of the timing, you went into even the racial issues that we're living with. I mean, you went all out. What was this book inside of you? Like it had to be written, or?
It did. So one of the things I think about is, so as an engineer, we're an I, so introvert, right? Like we really haven't been trained to think about social problems, right? I mean, else we would go into a different major. And I think that we have to lean into these, right? Because as an engineer, I'm going to respect an engineer. As a computer scientist, I'm going to respect a computer scientist. And that's just the way it is, right? And so if we don't lean in, then when someone that's not a computer scientist says, you should care, I'm like, yeah, but you're not a computer scientist. You're not trained, so you don't understand it. And so I think you just have to have the
right. You bring that layer of legitimacy.
Correct.
Yeah, and I guess you cover all the boxes. So
sure
yeah,
do.
so you have to, yeah. So see if there's any additional questions.
Absolutely. We do have a number of questions. So bias is drawing a lot of public attention now. Which other ethical issues related to AI do you think are currently under the radar that students need to be aware of?
Someone is looking for a dissertation topic there, right? Yeah,
so actually there's a couple. One is we don't do a good job about people with disabilities and the older generation. Right? We talk about, sex, race. We very little about ageism, very little bit about those who have special needs. And so that's an area that I think we need to do a lot more work. In fact, if you Google artificial intelligence and disabilities, you basically get like opinion pieces. You don't actually get hardcore, like this is a tool that can enable and engage. So that's one area. The other that's kind of, it's percolating is this whole area of weaponized AI. Like we kind of know it. There's like bans on like killer robots, and like while these bans are going on and people are signing it, there's backdoor deals going on. And so I think that's something that needs to be put out a lot more about what's actually going on in the different countries, including the US, that's weaponizing AI. And what role do we as the public have in the say of, what gets deployed? And so I can literally continue going, and I can name another 10, but those are just two that come to top of mind.
And you also talk about in the book how if AI and robots are going to earn our trust, of course, issues of transparency and accountability are essential. The problem, of course, is, I mean, I had a little bit of experience with the stone age of neural networks back when they never worked. But having I got enough of an understanding to know how impossible it is to know how they work once we've trained them, right? So you trained one of these machine learning algorithms with a data set, and now they're making decisions that can affect my life, like whether or not I get a ticket or whether or not I get arrested or I get bail or whatever it is. But there's no way to actually open up the machine learning system and to know why the machine did what they did. I mean, I guess a judge can do something that I disagree with. At least there is some hope I can get an explanation, but not in these systems. Is that like a structural impediment?
It is, but there is a whole field out there in roughly explainable AI where, so AI black box, right? Data comes in, data comes out, and you just have to believe it and trust it. But in this whole world of explainable AI is giving human understanding to the decisions that are made. So one, it may allow a doctor, for example, to realize that, one of the parameters the AI is thinking about is maybe gender or age. It also allows us as people to start questioning that's totally wrong. Whereas before it was oh yeah, that's right. But it's wait, hold it, your premise is incorrect, and therefore this is wrong.
All right, let's see if there's any last couple of questions.
Do you think that the way we treat robots reflects the true way we would treat humans if we did not have consequences in our society?
Ooh. That's a good one.
That's a big one.
Yes.
Ouch.
And so the very first word of the book, I'll give you an example, is sex. And so there's actually, just so you know, there are brothels with robot partners. And they do know that in some cases there are cases of violence. And so what does this mean? It probably means that people have some inner desires that they're not yet willing to have against their humans, but the robot is, it's okay. One of the things we worry about is that at some point that might translate to human-human interaction.
Do we have a way to measure and assess bias within AI systems like we do with implicit bias? And how do we track changes in AI bias?
So the community is working on this, of how do you determine bias within AI. There is no one solution. In fact, I think there's 21 definitions of what's fair and biased in AI. And that was maybe in January. So I'm sure there's double that now. There's no agreement, just like with implicit bias. There's really no agreement what that means. But the positive is that we're working on it. The negative is that there's no clear answer.
Are there any programs that allow people who are not in an engineering program to tour labs or facilities for their personal educational purposes?
I'm the interviewer.
So yes, I will tell you, Georgia Tech traditionally opens up the labs, at least the robotics labs, once a year. We have a week that's in March or April called Robotics Week. It's a national thing. And during that time, Georgia Tech opens up all the robotics labs. Other universities, wherever you are, open up their labs. So that's one week that we definitely know of.
Very good. Okay, one last question.
Tangentially related to that, how do you encourage bright high school students, especially students of color, to pursue degrees in computer science or engineering when they have the skill but not the interest?
Yeah, so interesting enough, at Georgia Tech, there's one program that's out of the College of Computing called Constellations. And one of the focus of Constellations is to engage high schoolers into basically learning computer science, but also wanting and thinking about it as a possible career later on. But it does require you to touch and have contact with the younger generation to say, hey, look, this is possible. This is good. This is what can happen. And, I always say, a Georgia Tech grad, how much they make, like as an undergrad student, and I show them the number and like, oh, what do I have to learn? Right. And so that's another motivation.
So let me begin to wrap this up, and first by giving you anything else that you would love to highlight about the book, or what sort of maybe your journey in writing it, or what you've learned from actually writing it. Anything you would like to add?
Yeah. So one of the things, and just a summary, we didn't talk a little bit about the story. But one of the things is, like, a lot of times students or individuals will see someone like, oh, they're so successful, they must have known when they were 2 what they were going to do. But we all have a story, and a lot of times that story could derail your ambitions in your career. And so I always say, read the story, because it happens to all of us. We all have stories about you went somewhere and you didn't feel like you belonged and you doubted yourself. We all have these stories.
We definitely do. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. I had I don't know how many of you watched the latest SpaceX NASA launch the other day. I still get chills every time we send humans into space. It's just odd that we've been able to do that. And what was different this time, though, is that the 3 persons who were commenting on the launch were 3 women, 3 engineers talking about what was going on. Of course, even the diversity of the astronauts that we were sending to the International Space Station were also very diverse. And I couldn't help by thinking, even what those moments, the message that it sends to kids back to this last question. And anyway, I feel like fair or unfair, people who have been the anomaly, as you have, carry that with them, right? That sort of almost this added responsibility, but it could be also a lot of fun of encouraging others to follow suit. And I appreciate very much what you do in that regard. Listen to this book. It's phenomenal, and the interpretation is absolutely a lot of fun. Let's give our guest a great round of applause. Thank you, thank you. That's it.